Have you ever wondered why French people always seem to say no? Or why they have a reputation for being complainers or even rude? Or why many conversations in France can feel like a debate? Well, I just finished reading this book called The Bonjour Effect, The Secret Codes of French Conversation Revealed, which definitely provided some good insights into what's really going on. And I wanted to share my thoughts on this topic and this book with you. I'm Susie, I'm American, and I've been living here in Dijon, France since 2008 when I got married to my French husband. So I've been interacting with people in French here in France for over 17 years now. I really enjoyed this book. Like Almost French, another book that I recently discussed here on my channel, which I also really enjoyed and I would definitely recommend. In the Bonjour Effect, I found some things a little bit exaggerated or maybe almost a little too categorical, which was also one of my critiques of Almost French as well. But other times I was nodding along in agreement or thinking to myself, wow, yes, they've just articulated something I feel like I've sensed on some level, but wouldn't be able to describe or explain like that myself. But I'm also afraid that it might give you the wrong idea that there are strict, inflexible rules in French conversation. Codes is the word that they use here on the cover, and guiding principles is another term that they use in the book. And I think that those terms are more apt. Also, there are tons of cultural observations and references to history in the book that are fascinating, enlightening, and entertaining, but not always directly linked to language and discussion. So I would encourage you to check out this book for those aspects as well. Here's some more important context. The authors, Julie Barlot and Jean-Benoît Nadeau, were living in Paris when they wrote this book. They mentioned spending only short periods of time outside of Paris. The book itself was written almost 10 years ago, and the authors were here in France for a total of about 4 years, I think. The author of Almost French, Sarah Turnbull, also lived in Paris, and I couldn't help but wonder if some of the differences I noticed between what these authors described and what I've experienced might come down to the fact that I don't live in Paris. I've never lived in Paris. I've lived in Dijon for the vast majority of the time that I've lived here in France. So some of the discrepancies that I noticed between what they described and what I've experienced may come down in part to regional differences as well. So in that case, how can the authors generalize about an entire country? Well, they make the argument that all French people have been put through the same educational system because there is a national curriculum, and therefore their argument is that people are formatted in the same way, in a sense, when it comes to speaking and conversation. That seems fair to me, although of course teaching styles can vary significantly as well, depending on different factors. But there was a quote from a friend of theirs that really rang true to me. She said, "The Savoyards don't talk like Parisians. They are a lot less interested in big ideas and more interested in practical questions." So there is some acknowledgement here about regional differences when it comes to conversational codes. After reading that, I tried to be very observant in social situations over the past few weeks to kind of see what types of conversation topics kept coming up. And once I started listening, I realized that a lot of the topics of conversation were quite concrete, quite logistical in a sense. Topics like, oh, how long did it take you to get here? Were there speed traps on the road on your way here? Did you go to that concert last week? How was it? What should we buy our friend for her birthday? What time does the party start? What should we bring? Where are you going for a vacation? Oh my gosh, it was so hot here 2 weeks ago. I heard there were going to be hailstorms tomorrow. Parisians aren't like that. They're more focused on big ideas. I don't know. I've never lived in Paris. One fascinating aspect of the author's background is that they are from Quebec, and I think at least one of them is a native French speaker themselves. So they bring this really interesting comparative aspect where they talk about how French is used in France versus in other French-speaking places. They mention that they have met, quote, "a number of native and fluent French speakers from places outside of France who find conversations with the French perfectly bewildering." So we're not just talking about language comprehension issues here, but really the underlying cultural issues. The authors try to boil everything down to really straightforward advice at the end of the book, which is helpful, but also potentially dangerous if taken too literally. So I thought I would run their advice by my resident French person, my husband, and share both his reaction to their advice and my own personal reaction to their advice after living here for 17 years. Definitely read the rest of the book, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on the end of the book and the quickfire section here where they cover 12 guiding principles of French conversation, do's, don'ts, and topics you can discuss anywhere in France, And finally, topics you should broach with care. But before we get started, I just wanted to mention that you can sign up for my email newsletter by scanning the QR code here or by clicking on the link in the video description below if you would like to receive more practical information about life in France delivered directly to your email inbox. So we will start with the 12 guiding principles. Number 1, the French don't communicate, they converse. So I read that to my husband with no context, and his response was, yes, we converse, we discuss, we talk. To him, the word communicate sounded too corporate and one-sided. But honestly, I personally didn't really grasp the author's distinction between communication and conversation. It was a bit too esoteric for me. But there was a section in the book when they were talking about this that did resonate. Maybe what they were trying to say here boils down to this quote. Quote, French conversation is not about connecting to others or showing interest in them. Unquote, which I thought personally was a little bit harsh. But here's the kicker. Quote, the objective of conversation is to show that you are interesting, unquote. When I read that, I thought, okay, maybe I had never considered that before. I don't necessarily think it's true, but I think it's something that's interesting to keep in mind as we're going forward. Guiding principle number 2, the French correct others all the time. It's normal public behavior. My husband did agree with this, but he said that he personally can no longer be bothered. And so this is something that he's basically stopped doing. I have 2 examples on this one. I have one example from sort of the French perspective and one example from sort of my perspective. I remember one time I brought one of my kids to the doctor's office, and I was talking to the doctor about giving my kid some Doliprane, so some paracetamol. And so I said something about de la Doliprane. And the doctor, instead of just acknowledging that what I had said, took a moment to gratuitously correct me. And he said, on ne dit pas de la Doliprane, madame. On dit du Doliprane. It was just so off-putting. And I think the memory has stuck with me all these years because it doesn't happen often, to be perfectly honest. And this wasn't in public. It was just the doctor, my kid, and me. But still, it's something that I remember, and it's something I actually actively avoid doing to my students. So I'm an English teacher, but the other example that I have is that my students oftentimes they're surprised when, for example, they give they speak in class, and instead of interrupting them to correct them, I'll encourage them and I'll say, okay, yeah, great, fine, yes, I understood. But I can tell that they've actually told me that they want me to maybe not interrupt them, but they definitely want feedback on their English speaking. And so now what I do instead is when they're doing a presentation, for example, I take notes and I give it to them because I don't feel like it's necessary to interrupt them. I know they need the feedback. They want the feedback, but I'm not going to interrupt while they're speaking to give them corrections in front of the others, in front of the entire class. Because interrupting them to correct them, to me, I find that disruptive and kind of condescending, maybe even embarrassing for them. And that's just not something I want to subject them to. Guiding principle number 3, the big one. The French say no even when they mean yes. So I ran this by my husband and his answer was just perfect. He said, non, but of course he was joking. He said, c'est un peu vrai quand même. It's pretty true. And he explained to me that it's because of his spirit of contradiction. The authors give some historical context. Quote, non is a foundational concept in French culture. It's actually something of a little r Republican reflex. The French Revolution was about the irrevocable right of all citizens to refuse. The no is not just arbitrary behavior. The authors argue that it's rooted in French culture and values. They also say, quote, luckily, non is often a oui in disguise, unquote, and that, quote, the French don't take non for an answer, and neither should you. Then they advise, quote, the best thing to do when facing a firm French no is to keep talking, unquote. The authors say, quote, no is a safe default. It's like their first instinct, the baseline response is a no, and then you have to work from there. With some effort and the right approach, if there is actually a little wiggle room, you can usually negotiate and find a solution that works for both of you, or as my husband put it, a compromise. The authors say that it's not manipulation, it's just how the conversation dance works here. The no isn't personal, it's procedural. My take on the no differs slightly from the authors in that I think sometimes when you get a no as a response, it's because the person that you're speaking to genuinely, honestly thinks that what you're asking of them is in fact impossible. That doesn't mean, however, that entering into the negotiation process and trying to come up with a compromise isn't in fact sometimes in your best interest, because oftentimes you can, in fact, find a compromise. So I agree with the authors in that no is, in fact, the beginning of a negotiation, and it's not necessarily the end of a conversation. So the next time you get a no in France, don't take it as a personal rejection and don't take it as the final word. It may just be the beginning of a longer negotiation process. In the end, you may be able to find a solution that works for everybody. I think it also connects to their belief that saying yes too quickly might seem naive or insufficiently thoughtful, and that being negative makes you sound more intelligent, which we'll talk more about in point 6. But next, moving on to point number 4, quote, the French hate saying, I don't know. They'll do anything to avoid it, unquote. My husband disagreed for himself, and he said, when I don't know, I say I don't know. But he told me also that he thinks that this is quite true maybe for other people. Personally, I definitely think it's true, especially again in the classroom context. Teachers are expected to be definitive experts in their fields. But personally, I take pride in saying I don't know in class in front of my students. I think it's really healthy to acknowledge that nobody can possibly know everything and that we can constructively look for the answers to their questions together in class. So yeah, I agree with this observation, but personally, I have consciously decided not to adopt this behavior when I'm teaching in the classroom. In the book, they give an incredibly relatable example to illustrate this. One of the authors goes to the supermarket and asks one of the clerks for margarine, and the supermarket clerk says, ça n'existe pas, it doesn't exist. And so the author has to explain exactly what it is that he's looking for. So he's like, okay, it's something that you spread on toast in the morning. It's like butter, but non-dairy, rich in omega-3s. And the clerk is like, oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. And so they figure out where the margarine is. And something very similar just happened to me very recently. I went to the supermarket and I was looking for whipped cream. And so I asked the clerk where the crème fouettée was, which is basically just whipped cream translated word for word. And the clerk, same thing, like he gave me this whole, blank stare, shaking of the head. And so I had to explain it, you put it on top of a tart and it's made with cream. The clerk was like, oh, chantilly? And I was like, oh yeah, of course, chantilly, that's what I mean. And because that's the word that they use more frequently to describe it. And so he took me to where the whipped cream was. And of course, all of the bottles were literally labeled crème fouettée, and they didn't even say chantilly on them. And I couldn't help myself. I had to point it out to the clerk and say, look, it says crème fouettée on the bottle. And he smiled and he was a good sport about it. But it just made me laugh because it's so similar to something that happened to me so recently as well. Guiding principle number 5, quote, the French are terrified of making mistakes and avoid looking like they've made them at all costs, unquote. My husband said it was un peu ça. A little like that. I blame the educational system again, which I find puts an immense pressure on students to construct perfect answers or not even bother. Personally, like with I don't know, I absolutely fess up to making mistakes in class all the time. I mean, we're human. We learn by making mistakes. The authors tried to search for some historical or cultural reasons to explain this, and this was one of the less convincing parts of the book for me. They were talking about how if people make a faute grave, like a serious mistake at work, then they could lose their jobs. But while that's true, the offense has to be really serious in order for it to result in a dismissal. And I think that most French people feel pretty secure in their jobs most of the time, unless their company is not doing well financially or something. I don't necessarily sense that people are scared of losing their jobs for making faute grave. I think French employees are generally pretty secure, feel pretty secure in their jobs. And I think it's more about saving face. They don't want to make mistakes because they don't want to be seen as incompetent. But that's just my take on it. Guiding principle number 6, quote, the French think being negative is good. It makes you sound smart, unquote. Remember how we talked about the default no earlier? Well, I definitely think that these two things are linked. And my husband absolutely agreed with this one. I'd actually never really thought about it this way, but it rings so true to me. So taking a look at some of the quotes from the book that can help us understand why, I found this one, quote, the French are the world's undisputed heavyweight champions of negativity. Negativity, pessimism, and skepticism are permanent and universal features of French discourse. And, quote, the French are chronically negative, unquote. Yes, I agree, but why is my question? And I found this explanation, quote, the French consider criticism to be more honest than praise, unquote. Maybe this explains why it's hard for my students to accept it when I praise them as opposed to criticizing them. And in terms of an explanation, again, quote, As France's most popular stand-up comedian Jamel Debbouze put it, you have to sound pessimistic to look intelligent in France, unquote. The authors go on to say, quote, negativism is a convenient form of intellectual prêt-à-porter, which they link to the fact that in France, intellectual tradition favors doubt. Also, they mention, to a lot of French, being happy seems naive. I think a lot of this can be summed up in a movie quote, which is meant to be humoristic, but and it does crack me up, which is, l'essentiel c'est de râler, ça fait bon genre. I translated it as, it's important to complain, it looks good. And the authors translated it as, the important thing is to moan. It makes you look respectable. I think we have our explanation there, and it's very satisfying. I really think they did a good job explaining this. Instinctively, it sounds right to me. It just seems to make sense. Guiding principle number 7, quote, if a French person talks to you, it's a sign they want some kind of relationship, unquote. Both my husband and I agreed, and this is not just about romantic relationships either. I think, for example, if you have a neighbor that chats with you one day, it's an excellent sign. They are probably looking to strike up a friendship with you. Guiding principle number 8, it's kind of the corollary. When the French don't want to talk, they don't open their mouth. My husband agreed, but with one major caveat. He said, you must say bonjour nonetheless, no matter what. But we'll talk about that more in a moment. I have an example of this one as well. Recently, I was on the tram and I realized that I was standing very close to the mother of one of my son's friends, but it was very early and she was sending signs, nonverbal cues that she didn't really want to interact with me. I think we said bonjour, we made eye contact, but then I think she kind of turned her head. And whereas my instinct would be to have insisted and kind of made, tried to make some small talk and chit chat, I didn't. I recognized that she clearly did not feel like interacting and she didn't want to engage with me. And I was very proud of myself that I kept my mouth shut and I respectfully left her alone on the tram. So maybe I am making progress in my ability to read French people a little bit better in some circumstances. There are 4 more guiding principles that I'm not going to go into much detail here, but I will read them for you and tell you what I thought and what my husband thought just quickly, just so you know. Number 9, the point of talking in France is to show you are interesting, not merely to convey information. They mentioned that earlier as well. This doesn't speak to me as well. And my husband thought this one was strange. He didn't get it. Number 10, the French don't look for consensus in conversation. Both my husband and I agree with this one. If you are someone who likes to spar verbally with people in social situations, then I think you will find lots of willing opponents here in France. But for me personally, most of the time, I also just can't be bothered with this. And I would rather just have a nice, relaxing, chill conversation where I find points of consensus with people that I'm talking with more than confrontation all the time. Number 11, disagreement among couples is acceptable public behavior. It's considered a sign that a relationship is strong. My husband said, yes, he agrees. And I generally do too. I don't even think of this as a big deal, disagreeing with your partner in public. It seems kind of normal to me now. And then finally, number 12, the French are comfortable making jokes about sex, even in professional situations, even when children are listening. My husband said, yes, that nobody cares. And I don't necessarily completely agree. Again, this may be my American side, but I think that's pretty inappropriate. Although this is something that I've noticed happening in social situations, but definitely not in professional situations. So that's it. That's the end of the guiding principles. Now we get to the do's and the don'ts. And we'll start with the do's. Number 1, quote, say bonjour like you mean it and say it a lot. If it feels like you're saying it too much, that's just enough, unquote. They explain it this way, quote, bonjour is not actually a word. It belongs to the linguistic category of fadics. The fadic function opens communication channels. There is, in fact, more meaning to bonjour than just the face value of the word itself. Quote, the most primary fadic function of bonjour is to announce, I am here. In France, you don't really exist unless you say so. I greet, therefore I am, unquote. So the corollary is, therefore, quote, if you don't say bonjour, you don't exist, unquote. I think we can consider this a hard and fast rule, and I completely agree with the authors on this one as well. Plus, I think this is just so easy and so nice to do, and it really does open doors for you. So if you don't say bonjour to someone, you run the risk of offending them. And that they might express the fact that they're unhappy, and that could come in different forms. It could come in like a look or some noise that they make, or even some little comment that they make under their breath. And that, I think, is what is often perceived as rudeness. And this could happen even in like the service sector, even if this person's job is ostensibly to provide you with service. In fact, the authors even said bonjour is, quote, the password for good service, unquote. So there you go. You can try it out the next time you're here in France and see if that works wonders on all of the people that you interact with. Do number 2. Quote, be provocative. It's better to say something outrageous than agree politely, unquote. My husband didn't really agree with this one, and this is not the type of conversation that I enjoy getting into, so maybe that's why I kind of avoid these situations in social settings. But this kind of goes back to the guiding principle number 10, the French don't look for consensus in conversation, and the book did contain some really good quotes trying to explain this in a little bit more depth. So for example, they said, quote, consensus and congeniality are not, generally speaking, things the French seek in conversation, nor do they expect them, unquote. And, quote, reaching consensus is usually the last thing the French really want to do when they enter into conversation, unquote. Okay. So that's shedding some light on the situation for me for sure. The authors also said, quote, in France, arguing contradictory viewpoints as though your life depends on it is not gauche. Up to a certain point, it's considered good fun, unquote. But I don't personally share the opinion that this is really that fun. So I think this is why French conversations can sometimes feel so intense for me personally with certain people, not with everybody. It's not just negativity, but it's also a cultural expectation to have opinions and to express them. I've been in situations, even recently, where people have asked me to express my opinion on a topic that I genuinely, honestly have no opinion about. And I'm not going to just invent something on the spot. So I tell them, like, I don't know, I don't have an opinion on that subject. And I think it's very unsatisfying for them. And again, maybe it's another example of me sort of refusing to make an attempt to fit in better. But sometimes I just don't have anything to say about certain topics. I was watching this other YouTube video the other day, and it was an interview with a Franco-American woman talking about her experience living in Paris. And something that she said really rang true to me as well. I'll read it to you. It was a quote. People think French people like to have a lot of arguments, but they're more discussions. And it's an open space to really discuss what you believe without it being anything against the person or what they believe, unquote. So that's good. It's a good reminder not to take things too personally and to remember that sort of arguing, in a sense, maybe debating is the better word, is kind of like a national sport for some people. And so if you find someone sort of wanting to get into it with you with the verbal sparring, it's nothing against you. It's just kind of fun for them. And to go back to almost French, Sarah Turnbull mentioned something like this in her book as well. She says France has a, quote, reputation for contrariness, and it also has, quote, a general culture of confrontation. And she says that it's, quote, unapologetic about being difficult, considering it merely a sign of strong character, unquote. So if we take all of these people's opinions about this, I think that we come to the same or similar conclusion. Do number 3, this will sound familiar, quote, never take no for an answer. Keep talking until you get oui, unquote. My husband agreed, and he said, I'm paraphrasing and translating here, I don't stop at no, otherwise you just pack up and leave. No is an objection. You can't work with the objection. What can we do to find a compromise? But sometimes when it's no, it's no. Now, moving on to the don'ts. The first don't, number 1, quote, don't ask for people's names. It's invasive, unquote. So at first I struggled to understand what this one was even referring to, because I'm thinking about how in social situations, for example, if you arrive somewhere and there's people in the group that you don't necessarily know, people just very naturally introduce themselves by giving their first name, and then in response, in return, the other person will give their first name as well. And then I was thinking too about playground situations where it's kids that don't know each other who are playing. They always ask each other their names, or an adult will ask a kid their name as well. But then I was thinking maybe this is in reference to, I don't know, again, maybe like in the service sector, for example. Maybe if you're in a restaurant, you wouldn't necessarily ask, I've never heard anyone ask the server what their name is, for example. So maybe that's what this is referring to. I'm not sure. It seems a bit context specific to me. When in doubt, just look at what the other French people around you are doing, and if they're asking each other their names, then I think then it's fair game. Don't, number 2, quote, don't make jokes about yourself. Self-deprecating humor makes you sound stupid, unquote. I was trying to think back on this one. I mean, this is something I do all the time, so this is definitely another way that I'm not doing a good job fitting in, I suppose. But I was trying to think of examples when other people, French people, make self-deprecating remarks. And it's true, I can't necessarily think of examples off the top of my head, but it's not something that I've noticed people not doing either. But maybe this is just something I've never noticed before too. Number 3, quote, don't ask, where are you from? It's insinuating. Ask, what region are you from? Unquote. This is kind of a strange one for me too, like insinuating what? That the person that you're talking to isn't really French? People try to figure out where I'm from all the time. And the question that they usually ask me is, you have a little accent. Where is it from? So they're not asking where I'm from, but they're asking where my accent is from, which is fine. I don't mind telling them where I'm from. They're curious about me, and so I'm happy to tell them. In social situations, I think most of the time I just assume that the person I'm speaking to is French unless they have a really strong accent or they're struggling to speak in French, in which case we have the sort of we're both foreigners connection, and then we'll talk about, where we're from. But in terms of French regions where people come from, it's true that this kind of seeps into the conversation. You'll pick up on hints as well. People often, I don't know, they'll have a little bit of an accent from some different part of France, or they'll make a reference to some vocabulary word that they use in their part of the country, or they'll talk about some local dish that they grew up loving or something. So yeah, there are definitely hints that you can pick up on. And if you ask someone what region they're from, I'm sure that they'll enjoy telling you about where they're from. As for my husband, he usually asks people, instead of where are you from, he says, are you from around here? And then that way, wherever they are, wherever they find themselves, it can kind of break the ice and the person can say, yeah, I grew up around here, or no, I'm actually from Alsace or whatever. And that can lead into a nice conversation as well. Then finally, the authors give you a list of topics, first, that you can discuss anywhere in France, and they include language. The French love talking about words. And I would add, too, that the French love wordplay and making silly jokes. That's something that I've noticed my husband doing quite a lot. Next, geography or history. Quote, the French are well-versed in both topics. And when I asked my husband about this, it didn't really resonate with him, but again, maybe it's a Parisian thing. Next, food. Quote, always easy, but better when you know a bit about French geography and history. Yes, food seems like it's always a safe topic. You can talk about what you're eating. You can talk about the place where you are if it's a restaurant, what's on the menu. You can talk about what you're going to be eating in the next meal. You can talk about local specialties. There is so much that you can talk about when it comes to food, for sure. Next, quote, art, cinema, or literature. The French always have an opinion about culture, unquote. I don't know. I feel like I hear people talking more about things that they've seen on TV, heard on the radio, or like TV shows or series that they're streaming lately. I definitely think that art, cinema, and literature are good conversation topics. And if you are a consumer of these things and people are interested to hear what you think about what you've seen lately or read lately, I just don't think that these are the most frequent topics of conversation. They're definitely fair game. Maybe it's just the fact that I live in Dijon. I'm not sure. Next, quote, finding deals. This is the only way French talk about money, unquote. I agree that finding deals is definitely something people talk about a lot. People often complain about how expensive things are, and people are often like exchanging promo codes and things like that. This is definitely something that's done a lot anyway in my sort of social circle. But the only way people talk about money, I'm not sure. I see this a lot. I see this reference to money being a taboo in France, and I just don't really buy it. I think people talk about money quite a bit, but then again, it's one of my favorite topics, so maybe my ear is just attuned for when this comes up in conversation. Next, quote, holidays. This is how the French prove they don't like their jobs, unquote. So when they say holidays, they mean vacation. And yes, this is a very frequent topic of conversation. In fact, I saw a quote in the book that said, holidays are considered to be a basic necessity. And that's absolutely true. But I don't buy the fact that this is because French people want to prove they don't like their jobs. I think it's because they want to talk about how they have so many other interests outside of their jobs. I think that here the mentality is really work to live, not live to work. And I think talking about your vacation is just one way of doing that. Another topic that wasn't mentioned in this section of the book, but that they mentioned in another point was, quote, the French love to hear foreigners' observations and insights about their own country, unquote, about France. And I definitely think that's true. People are often asking me like, oh, is it hard for you to live here? What do you think about living here? And things like that. And they are interested to hear what I think. And just be careful, because if you praise France too much, people will not necessarily agree with you. It's interesting how they handle that when you compliment living here in France. But it's definitely, I think, a safe topic as well. Or it's a question that people will ask you. So be prepared for that as well. And there are a few other topics that are discussed quite frequently here in Burgundy anyway. And I bet you can see where I'm going with this one. Wine. Yes, absolutely. And again, going back to the money thing, what I think is kind of funny is that if you bring a bottle of wine to someone's house, oftentimes, well, my husband anyway, he'll say how much he paid for it or how much he bought it for. And again, I think the idea oftentimes is like trying to get good deals. Like if you have a really good wine and you didn't pay too much for it, it's probably because you bought it directly from the winemaker. And then you want to tell that whole story and everything. And then people want to, pour the wine and discuss the wine and look at the wine and talk about the flavors and the aromas and everything. And the vintage and everything. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to wine. And then you can also sort of move into the next topic that people wind up talking about a lot too, which is weather. And weather and wine often go together because depending on the vintage of the wine, you can go back in your memory and think about what the season was like that year. And then there's a lot of, people who work in the wine industry as well. So weather is something that's a very important topic to them in this area as well. And another topic that I've noticed people talking about a lot recently in the past couple of weeks is your trip, your journey. Like, how did you get here today? Was there a lot of traffic? Did it take you a long time? Did you find a parking spot? How long did it take? Was it faster or slower than usual? Was the train on time? That kind of thing. Like, I feel like there's a lot of small talk about these topics as well. So that being said, I find it really strange, ironic that the authors say at one point, quote, they, the French people, like going beyond chit chat as soon as possible. I don't agree. I mean, again, maybe this is a Paris versus outside of Paris thing, but I hear a lot of people just engaging in small talk and chit chat a lot of the time. And then finally, quote, topics that you should broach with care. The first one is, quote, family. It's private in France, something you only talk about with close friends, unquote. I mean, I don't necessarily agree. I think that you don't talk about your family with perfect strangers. You wouldn't talk about your kids with the cashier or with, someone working at the post office, for example. But I think that you do talk about with your kids, for example, or your family with not just close friends, with acquaintances as well, and maybe with colleagues that you're friendly with. So I'm not sure I necessarily understand this one. Next, still in the topics to broach with care, quote, work. Don't ask what someone does for a living. The French consider it either boring or nosy, unquote. I don't know. I agree that this is not the first question that people ask. It's not like, oh, hi, how are you? What do you do? I think that's true. I mean, a whole evening can go by without anyone talking about work, that's for sure, and without anyone asking you what your job is, for example. But if someone is interested and they ask you what you do, it's not like it's like top secret. And I don't think that talking about your job with friends or acquaintances, I don't think it shows that you're overly enthusiastic about your job either. So I'm not really sure I understand this one either. The next topic to broach with care is, quote, money. No one thinks it's interesting, unquote. But we just talked about how French people love to talk about getting good deals, and they talk about how much they've paid for things. I hear people say all the time that money is taboo in France, and I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I think that people are willing to talk about money a little bit. I mean, I like to talk about money, so maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm not reading the room on this topic. But in the book, they said, quote, talking about money is a little vulgar, unquote. And then on the next page, they said, quote, the French love talking about how expensive life is, unquote. And even though this book was written 10 years ago, that's definitely still true today. So next, quote, national identity, immigration, race relations, and politics are tricky. Stick to asking questions, unquote. So again, I think this is probably situation specific, but I certainly hear people talking about politics a lot. So I think, again, maybe these topics definitely need to be handled with care for sure. But I don't think that they're all necessarily completely taboo either. So that's it. That's the end of the quick tips section of this book. The bottom line is that the book is great. I absolutely recommend it, but I definitely don't think that you should treat this list or the book itself as a rule book, aside from saying bonjour everywhere, all the time. That is a hard and fast rule that you should probably internalize and follow for sure. This book was really helpful at providing some cultural context behind French conversational styles, even for me, even after 17 years. I really found some parts of this book were really eye-opening. I just think it's important to remember that we're all learning as we go through this journey together, navigating in different countries and different languages and just doing our best to be understood and, doing our best to spend time together and understand each other a little bit, try to understand where we're coming from a little bit more. And I think it's okay to make mistakes. I really do. I mean, it's part of the learning process, isn't it? Have you read this book? I would love to know what you thought. And I'd also like to know more about your own experience with French conversation styles and topics as well. If you found this video and this topic interesting, I would definitely encourage you to go ahead and use the QR code here or the link in the video description below to go ahead and sign up for my email newsletter. You will receive more practical information about life in France delivered directly to your email inbox. And I will link here to a playlist with other videos about books about life in France that you can check out if you're interested in those as well. Thank you so much for watching today, and until the next time, à bientôt!